Let's get started. I'd like to wrap this up about 1:30, so we'll get going here. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Chris Cervanek. I am the Associate Director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and we are most honored to have John Kamm with us today for what we've counted as his third visit to Notre Dame. John is an American businessman and human rights campaigner active in China since 1972, although he doesn't look that old. He is the founder and executive director of the Dui Hua Foundation, whose name refers to the foundation's strategy of advancing rights through dialogue. Based in San Francisco and Hong Kong, Dui Hua works to promote clemency for at-risk detainees in China. Its work focuses on political prisoners, those sentenced to death, juvenile detainees, and women in prison. Before launching Dui Hua, John was educated at Princeton and Harvard, going on to become a successful businessman, managing Occidental Chemical Corporation's business in China and the Far East for many years, and serving as the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. Since his first intervention on behalf of a Chinese prisoner in May of 1990, he has made more than 100 trips to China to engage the government in a dialogue on human rights, focusing on the treatment of prisoners and the conditions in prisons. For his remarkable and effective human rights work inspired by his skills honed as a businessman, John was awarded the Department of Commerce's Best Global Practices Award by President Bill Clinton in 1997 and the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights by President George W. Bush in 2001. And in September 2004, he received a MacArthur Fellowship for, quote, designing and implementing an original approach to freeing prisoners of conscience in China, end quotes. And in the words of New York Times correspondent Tina Rosenberg, no other person or organization in the world, including the State Department, has helped free more Chinese prisoners. We are most fortunate to have John with us today to discuss the quality of mercy, Dui Hua's work in China. John will also talk about Dui Hua's recent initiative on the protection of the rights of women prisoners. Our Center for Civil and Human Rights is grateful to the Kellogg Institute and the Liu Institute for their support of John's visit in general and for this public lecture today. So please join me in welcoming John Kamm.
Thank you, Chris, for that very generous introduction. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. Last day of my visit here to Notre Dame. I've got a presentation which I will work through, and I'd like to leave plenty of time for questioning, and that is sometimes a challenge because I very much enjoy coming to campuses to speak with, learn from students and faculty and members of the community. And I enjoy it. I enjoy talking, and sometimes that's a problem because I get to talking too long. Actually, not long ago, I was speaking at a little college out in California, and as I was really getting into the substance of the matter, a gentleman in the back row stood up and walking out on me. And I said, well, where are you going? I haven't finished speaking yet. And he said, well, I'm going to get a haircut. and I asked him, I said, well, why didn't you get a haircut before coming here to listen to me? And he said, well, before coming here to listen to you, I didn't need a haircut. So I will try to keep it a little briefer today. Let's see now. So actually, this is the very first slide, and what you will see here is yours truly, visiting with a Tibetan. The gentleman sitting to my left, a fellow by the name of Jigme Sangho. When he was released in 2002, he was at that time the longest serving person, serving a sentence for the crime of counter-revolution in China. And here I am visiting him at the monastery in Riegland, Switzerland. There's a Tibetan monastery on the outskirts of Zurich. Switzerland has the largest population of Tibetans of any country in the world outside of India, of course, and China. So there he is, and I went to see him there. He's still there. I understand, actually, he's just published his autobiography, and they're translating it into English. And the first chapter tells the story of my going down to Lhasa to extricate him from the prison. So I'm looking forward to reading it myself. I don't know what he's going to say. All right, so Chris has already basically outlined this. That's our mission. We work to help at-risk prisoners. And those include people who are in political imprisonment, the political prisoners, people facing the death penalty, juvenile offenders, and women in prison. And as Chris said, I'm going to spend a little time on that last point towards the end of the presentation. Based in San Francisco, we have consultative status with the United Nations, which is pretty rare for a human rights group that works on China. And the reason it's rare is because the Chinese government basically stands in the way of other human rights groups. And they wield a lot of power in the NGO committee. So our political prisoner work is founded on two assumptions. Those who are asked about receive better treatment. This is not unique to China. Virtually every penal system in the world, if you're a famous prisoner and you're being asked about, you typically receive better treatment. And also the assumption that they're large, basically unexplored records, what we call open sources, with the names of prisoners, political prisoners. And that really is an assumption on which the foundation was set up. We got our first grant to look for the names of prisoners. When we asked for the grant, the reaction was, well, you're not going to find any, because China doesn't put this kind of information in writing. Well, they were wrong. In fact, China does. And we have uncovered thousands of names, and we do so on a regular basis. I'm going to a university library next month, and I fully expect to find at least 200 names that are not known elsewhere in the world, except, of course, to the Chinese government, the people that run the prisons. Okay, and we want to look at our research, our publications and database. Go to our website, www.duihua.org, and you can look at virtually everything we produce. We put it on our website. What you see before you is a print edition of our most recent newsletter, but you can find that online, and along with a lot of other interesting material. Well, people ask, what is your approach? Well, first of all, it's based on trust. For various reasons, the Chinese government and I have a relationship which is built on trust. We try to identify common ground. So, for instance, China, a few years ago, decided at very senior levels that they needed to reform their system of juvenile justice. And they put it in their 5-year legal reform plan. And we found out about it. I went to the Supreme Court, and we began a relationship, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Gender issues, especially, as I say, women in prison, which is such a pressing area for work. Not only in China, but in this country, I would have to say even more so. I have to say that, I'm giving you a presentation on China. But a lot of the work we do has direct application here in the United States. So we do work on human rights issues here. And this Women in Prison Symposium addressed an issue that is of global nature. Population of women prisoners around the world is soaring. Double and triple the rate of increase of males. This is a very disturbing phenomenon. Frequent communications. Not a day goes by without a conversation between me and somebody in the Chinese government. Sometimes they're very low rank, sometimes they're middle rank, sometimes they're high rank, sometimes it's email, sometimes it's phone call, but it can't be face to face. When you're talking about sensitive things, they won't put it in the email. We have, you can read this. We have relationships with governmental and non-governmental actors. We try to learn from the experience of other NGOs, foreign diplomats. When I go to Beijing, I always meet with journalists, foreign diplomats, not with, obviously, human rights groups, because they don't get to travel there, at least external ones. There are, of course, domestic groups. You see, careful use of language. I say avoid political prisoners. Well, I've just said political prisoners several times, so what am I talking about? I mean in discussions with the Chinese government, all right? Now, when they let their guard down, they might even talk about political prisoners. But the way you do it is you refer to people who have been convicted of the crime of endangering state security, disturbing the public order, whatever, you name the crime, all right? Or you might even say prisoners who were detained in political cases. You see, in the literature, if you look at the actual Chinese literature, you will see references to political cases. And they'll take the position, we don't have political prisoners, but we have political cases. But we don't want to go there. It's just, that's the reality. They detain, who is a political prisoner? It's a person who was detained in a political case, who was subsequently convicted and sent to prison. That's what a political prisoner is. Always, temper criticism with praise, use media creatively, which I think I've had a reasonably good history of. Be prepared to address rights violations in the West, including, as I've just mentioned, the way the United States treats women in prison, which in many respects is a national disgrace. We are, I think we're the only country in the world, 32 of our 50 states, it is legal to shackle women in childbirth, women prisoners. And it is done. It's not just legal, it is done. So they shackle women in childbirth in 32 states. Nobody does that. Nobody. So you've got to be able to say, okay, we got our problems, you got your problems. It makes for a much easier conversation. Show respect. When I hand over a list, it's not in English. It may have an English translation, but it's in Chinese. And finally, rely on open source research. So we find the names in Chinese materials, publications. And when we file an inquiry, we base it on something that's in a Chinese publication. This guy is now China's third-ranking foreign official. He was ambassador to the UN. And, well, that's what he told the New York Times a few years ago, 12 years ago. Here are examples of our publications. We have a very large database. This is what it basically a summary. We have 28,000 records, growing every day. We have what we call an active registry. Those are records of people who are in prison. But we keep records on people who have been released or who otherwise, even deceased. Okay, we keep records. And in large part because political prisoners have a very high recidivism rate. Right? They tend to go back to prison. We have a guy, John Lin, I think this was his 4th time he's going to prison since 1989. He's now about to face trial. Fortunately, his young daughters were able to leave him and get education in this country. That's something I have a little to do with. But these are the basic groups, and as you can see, Falun Gong is right there at the top. So we do ask about Falun Gong. We ask about people who are in prison for the nonviolent expression of their beliefs. Chinese accept this. Okay, so you got active official registry. Those are names that come from official sources, whether it be publications, internet, deep internet research, or responses by the Chinese government to prison cases. Those are the 3 main sources. But of course, we get communications from family, other NGOs, and what have you. Unofficial, those are prisoners about whom we have gained information from unofficial sources. And of course, there is some overlap. You do have some unofficials and officials, so you have entries for both. We also have a mass incident database. It's much smaller in size, only about 5,000 records. And since there are about 180,000 mass incidents a year in China, we're really getting such a small percentage that I myself question the value of this. You know, we were asked to do it by a customer, client, and we did it. You know, they give us money to do it, so interesting, I don't think particularly valuable, but there you go. Here's a sample case list. All right? For those of you who do not read Chinese, that is a list of prisoners in Jiangsu province. And you can see it's in simplified Chinese script. If you read it, those of you who read it, you can see that it's strictly factual. You know, there may be reports out there that so-and-so has been treated badly. Unless we have what I consider to be evidence, proof, testimony, which is very hard to get hold of, we don't put that in. We do not send the prison authorities an inquiry that winds up saying, please stop torturing this person, okay? We don't do that. So you know, it's name, rank, and serial number. So you have a name, sex, where he's from, in this case they're all male. In 1998, in May, this guy was arrested for inciting the subversion of state power. Please tell us tell us what's happened to him, what the length is, has the sentence ended. So this is an obscure prisoner. All right. Next, here's a response from the Chinese government. If they don't spell out the name, they give the initials. All right. They don't sign it. This is what in diplomacy you call a what? A non-paper. This is a term that those of you who go on to the exalted world of diplomacy will become familiar with. A non-paper. That's an unsigned, undated document. So nobody can say this came from anybody, but this is an official response. And yeah, you can see right there that in that very first case, turned out he was sentenced to 2 years. You know, we found this guy's name in some provincial record. We knew he had been detained and arrested. Once you're detained, then you're arrested. So we assumed he'd been tried. So we asked about this person. We didn't know what the sentence was. Now we know. So he got a 2-year sentence. All right. Now, this is very new. That last number is an estimate based on the work of the state procuratorate that was made at the just concluded National People's Congress. And you can see that while indictments for endangering state security remain high, they've been coming down. So we issued a blog on why that is happening. And you can read it, but the reason it's happening is that for Han prisoners in particular, the Chinese government is not using the crime endangering state security, they're using crimes of disturbing the public order. So instead of inciting subversion, you get gathering a crowd to disrupt public order, or illegal assembly, or spreading rumors and causing trouble. All right? So the people are being locked up for that reason. Now, obviously, this has, well, first of all, it's not good. Not good. But here's what's interesting to me. Crimes of disturbing social order carry far less severe sentences. Example, Liu Xianbin in Sichuan got an 11-year sentence for inciting subversion, as did Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel laureate who is imprisoned in Liaoning, 11 years. Xu Ziyong, who was just sentenced for disturbing public orders, got a 4-year sentence. So right there, there's a difference. The second difference is that sentence reduction and parole for disturbing public order prisoners is much easier than for political, endangering state security. They're all political. Endangering state security, sentence reduction, clemency is very strict, very difficult. But for disturbing social order, it's actually not uncommon. And finally, if you're convicted of disturbing public order, typically you don't have what's called a supplemental sentence of deprivation of political rights. So in those three areas, actually Hu Jia himself said, and he's a very famous dissident, this is actually good news, he said, on several scores, including what I just said. But he also said, it shows that the Chinese government is ashamed to convict people of subversion. I thought that was an interesting take. I don't usually think of the Chinese government being ashamed, but there you go. And I just gave you, over the last 12 months or so, these are examples of cases that I have worked on, we have worked on, where people have been granted clemency. There you go. There's just 5, but there are probably about a dozen or so that I could cite. Some of them quite significant. Look at that third guy. This is a publisher called Yang Jiantian, whose name we found in open source. Sentenced to life in prison for publishing Falun Gong. Publishing. And so he's had his sentence commuted and has already gotten 4 sentence reductions. So I expect that we'll work it out. You'll get out. Believe it or not, and even in June 4th cases, we do have examples of courts who say, wait a minute, that really was over the top. It's just too much. And they act occasionally. And in this case, they've been doing it. All right, now we move to this. So, what I've just been talking about is getting people out of prison or getting better treatment. That's not systemic change. Actually, there are even some who say, well, by doing this, you forestall systemic change because you sort of let the steam out of the pot. You let some of the pressure off. It's a valid view, but, I happen to think that if you can save one life, you save the world entire. That's what I believe. So I work on saving lives. I don't think in those grand terms. But we do work to change the system. And we have done a number of things. I myself have been in several prisons, 10. They don't like to let me in anymore, but I do. Actually, I was just in a prison in Hong Kong, a women's prison. Hong Kong has the highest percentage of women prisoners of any system in the world, by far. US is 9%, women prisoners. China has 6. Hong Kong has 20. I was just in that prison, very educational. Attendance at Chinese trials, been in several trials, and I'm happy to report I was in Beijing and talked to several European diplomats, and they are managing to get in more trials. This is something I've been advocating for years. Not state security trials, all right? Or even sensitive trials like Shuziong, they won't let me. But for other trials, I've gotten into death penalty trials. And it makes a difference. The judge sees a foreigner in the audience, you know, they treat the defendant better. It's a different system, you know. You can even meet with a judge while the hearing is going on and make a plea for the defendant, if you can believe that. In this country, you would be jailed for contempt, for even trying to do that. But in China, you know, they do it. Although one guy did get in trouble, I understand, recently. Anyway, equal access to parole, that's been a big area for us because the Chinese authorities do handle political prisoners much more strictly. So rates of clemency are much less. And we have been working for several years in the United Nations and with various governments to promote equal access to clemency. Of course, this is ICCPR, International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, counter ratification, and specifically what's known as Article 16. Article 16 provides for granting benefits to people serving sentences for crimes who've had the penalty reduced. All right? That's in the International Covenant. So the old crime of counter-revolution, obviously the penalty has been reduced, right? They've taken it out of the criminal law. What is the penalty for counter-revolution? The answer is 0, because counter-revolution doesn't exist as a crime. So I've been arguing that for several years, and had a very interesting conversation with a Ministry of Justice official. He said, well, you're right. You know, we've studied this, and yes, you're right, but we're not going to do it. Basically, you have to admire their forthrightness. We're not going to do it. And by the way, we don't do it either. So it's not automatic. But in this country, you do have something called habeas corpus. And you know, a lawyer goes before a judge and says, Your Honor, they've reduced the penalty for this crime from this to this. My client has already served this. Please release it. And you have habeas corpus. Most of the time, they'll release you. China doesn't have habeas corpus. Juvenile justice, sharp reduction in death penalty, use of special pardons, and women in prison. Okay, this is just a rundown on China's juvenile courts, juvenile system. The last actual prison on the mainland I was in was a juvenile prison in Beijing. So they are moving to a system of juvenile courts. So we say more than 50% arrested. Well, about 3 years ago, about 2/3 of Chinese youth who were arrested wound up in prison. So 66%. In this country, it's about 21, 22%. In Europe, it's 10, 12%. In 2013, I was just in Beijing, 46%. You see what we call custodial function. Right? So it's a drop. We've had 3 exchanges with them, and they've had a big impact. So starting January 1st, 2013, for the very first time, China has in its criminal procedure law a section on juveniles. Juvenile crime. First time. And that reflects exchanges with NGOs like Dui Hua, and to some extent governments. Here are some of the things that they put in there. They call it postponed prosecution. Right? We call that diversion. All right, in this country, in the juvenile justice system, the concept of diversion, restorative justice, The idea basically is you want to divert the young person from the path to prison, right? And so there's there's a system in place. It varies from county to county, but essentially the young offender and the family make a deal. And it's very precise, right? You will stay away from so-and-so, so-and-so. You will be home by such an hour. You will, get your grades up, etc. You make it an agreement, and you sign it. And if you make that agreement, you are, in effect, put on probation. You are diverted, right? After a period of time, again, it varies, 6 months, a year, if you have not committed any other offenses, your record of arrest, even detention, is what we call sealed. That's a bit of a misnomer. It's expunged, except for certain crimes. Sexual crimes, all right? National security crimes, all right? If you phoned in a bomb threat, you're not going to get your record sealed, all right? But for most crimes, your record is sealed. So they've adopted this. More protections, for instance, for female detainees. It is required that a female officer be present during interrogation. That used to be, not necessarily was the case. Okay, I'm going back to Beijing in October, and it'll be our 4th exchange. And we're going to just look at sealing of records, because they're having a lot of problems with it. And there are a lot of problems in this country, too. You know, a court can order the police to seal a record. Sometimes the police don't. And I dare say, if it's an FBI record, mostly they don't. And what are you going to do? You can sue, but it's never been done. So, you can see we've had a small improvement in terms of non-custodial measures. So custodial should be 54, I'm sorry. So down to 50. Non-custodial is 46. This is something I wrote for the New York Times. So, very, it's the businessman's approach to doing human rights. You got to give a little to get a little. Right? So what we gave was a lot of expert advice on the reform of their juvenile system. And that makes it easier, more palatable for the Chinese government. Talk to me about sensitive things. And they can say, oh yeah, well, he's helping us with women in prison and juvenile justice, and look at this is just published in the New York Times, see? All right? So, okay. We'll respond to his most recent prison case. And that's pretty much what's going on. We're getting towards the end here. So, at the end of 2010, the UN passed, the General Assembly, by consensus, the minimum standards for women prisoners and non-custodial offenders. Because again, the emphasis is on trying to encourage non-custodial measures. These are commonly known as the Bangkok rules. Why? Well, very simple. The granddaughter of the King of Thailand is only granddaughter. So she's the favorite granddaughter, a princess. Educated in the United States, went to law school, Columbia, goes back to Thailand where she's a prosecutor. How do you like to face her in a trial? She doesn't lose many cases, okay? But she goes to a prison, a women's prison. And one of the women prisoners comes up to her and prostrates herself. before the princess. And she's so moved by this that she starts to look into the situation of women in prison around the world. And given her status, that means a lot. I mean, she goes to a country and, she's the princess of Thailand, favored granddaughter of the king. She asks for a meeting, she gets a meeting. It's not like, some schmo like me. I'm lucky if I can get a cup of coffee with some of these people on Starbucks. But no, she gets high level, so she starts to push for this, and with other experts in the field, many of them in Geneva, they come up with these minimum standards, which I commend to you. They're nothing earth-shaking. Women should never be housed with men in the same facility, including different cell blocks, please. If you've got a warden who's a male, and you got a cell block here with males, and then you got a cell block with females, it is not the same as having a dedicated facility for women, for all kinds of reasons, which I won't go into. But I will say one thing. In this country, 50% of pregnancies of women in prison are the result of rape by guards. So that's a very good reason to have maximum number of female guards and minimum number of male guards. And I'm sorry to say that is not the case. In Chowchilla, which is the United States' largest women's prison, over 3,000 women inmates, more than 50% of the guards are men. And these guys are big guys, all right? Former special forces, SEALs, this kind of thing. They carry 25 pounds of body armor and plenty of weaponry to back it up. This is a terrible situation when you go and see with your own eyes. All right, well, in China, fast-growing female prisoner population. So by now it's about 100,000 women prisoners. 36 women prisoners have at least one, except Tibet. Tibet does not have a dedicated female prisoner. So that's a recommendation that we're making. And there are no dedicated detention centers in the whole country. So every detention center has, if there are female detainees, they have a separate area. They don't have a separate detention center yet, not one. And domestic violence is a main cause of incarceration. There was a news conference given by the Supreme People's Court on February 27th. Two striking statistics. 25% of all marriages in China suffer from domestic violence. So 25% of married women are subjected to domestic violence in China. 1 in 10 homicides is the result of domestic violence. Either the guy goes too far and kills her, or the woman fights back and kills him. And in fact, a case I'm working on right now, and when I give this speech in Washington next week, I'm going to end by asking the Supreme Court to grant clemency to a woman by the name of Li Yan, who has been sentenced to death because she killed her husband, who was brutally abusing her. He came after her. He had 3 previous wives, and he boasted a lot about how he used to beat them all up. And he beat this young woman up and came after her with a gun, the butt of a rifle. She managed to get it out of his hands, and he didn't stand much of a chance after that. She just did it. She was sentenced to death in August of 2012. Still hasn't been executed. It's a big case in China. So hopefully she will be spared. And finally, this is our most recent event, initiative, 2 years in the making. We held this international symposium on women in prison. We had 25 experts from around the world, 10 different countries. Biggest contingent from China. We had 11 from the mainland, 2 from Hong Kong, and 1 from Taiwan, from the police academy. very interesting. But Argentina, India, Thailand, U.S., U.K., etc. I wish we could have had more, actually, but kind of ran out of money. I don't have a slide about that. How to get money. You don't think I'm going to be telling you guys that. Anyway, yeah. So those are our goals, the attendance. We have the Red Cross, we have the UN, we have 10 countries, big representation from China. Okay, so I will mention this. So I had to run around and get money. And it's very interesting. You know, governments have different priorities in terms of human rights. You know, for the United States, it's basically civil and political rights, especially speech and association. All right, that's by far, that's the priority. But you know, some countries, well, you know, certainly, that's important. They also put a lot of priority on different things. And the Netherlands, in particular, are leaders in gender issues. So I went to them, and they gave me a grant to do independent field research in Chinese prisons, women's prisons. Now that's a tall order. But fortunately, there's a very committed, talented legal reformer at Renmin University who uses his local connections and got into 2 women's prisons and 3 detention centers. Handed out 500 questionnaires and got 450 or 460 responses. And the results he presented at the symposium were absolutely fascinating. You know, what are the top issues for women in prison? Number one, hot water. They need hot water. They need more hot water than men. I don't think I have to go into the reasons for that. But they need hot water. And it's on all the questionnaires. Secondly, visitation. In Chinese prisons, you get half-hour meeting every month with family members. And if you're a woman prisoner, or you're any prisoner, the meeting takes place behind a glass partition. Obviously, they don't have things like conjugal visits. When we asked in Hong Kong, you know, do you have conjugal visits? They said, what is that? They had no idea what we were talking about. So anyway, it's very revealing, and that was a highlight. But we had papers on all these other issues. We had China's top expert on domestic violence come and give a presentation. And she was a star of this news conference. She actually flew back from the symposium to go to the news conference. All right, well, what are the results? Well, it's too soon to say, of course. A lot of the experts said, well, I'm going back, and this is giving me a lot to think about. For instance, Norway. Norway has a really progressive women's prison, but they do not allow children to stay with women in their prison. And this is a big debate. You know, you got to weigh all the interests of the family. Needless to say, in this country, children do not stay with their mothers in prison. Actually, in California, the child is taken away within 48 hours of birth. So in Hong Kong, the child can stay with the mother for 3 years. It differs from place to place. So in Norway, they don't. But afterwards, the warden she was the warden of this prison, you know, said, you know, I'm gonna think about that based on what I've heard and what I've seen. Maybe we should amend our policy. So it's too soon to say. But the Bangkok rules have been adopted by the Hong Kong Correctional Services Department. And this last item, a prosecutor was there from the province. And at the end of this, he announced that he was going to organize a pilot project to implement the Bangkok in their women's prison. So we'll see. I'd like to see that happen. Well, we still have time for questions. That is my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to have questions. Victoria.
Thank you. Of course, your work is so admirable. But I wonder to what extent success is a two-edged sword in the way that Beijing can tell the world, you see, look at John Kamm's work. We work with him, so we are so open, and so we actually reform-minded. And then the last time you were praised for loving and respecting China was in 2002. So you think the situation is better today than 12 years ago or worse?
In some areas it's better, in some areas it's worse, in most areas it's about the same. Doing this for 25 years, and I just find it impossible to make a sweeping generalization and say human rights is getting worse or human rights is getting better. With respect to juveniles, treatment of juveniles is getting better. Okay. With respect to women in prison, it's getting better. I can cite to law and practice. With respect to people who exercise their international rights, speech and association, it is not getting better. One thing that has changed is that they can actually get lawyers who fight for them, at great peril to the lawyers. But you know, when I started this work, the definition of a lawyer in China was someone who helps you plead guilty. That was what a lawyer was. Now you can find a lawyer. And like I say, they're very brave, and they often wind up on my lists, obviously. Of course, really, there are tragic situations in the minority areas. Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia. In these areas, it is very hard to argue things are getting better. You can say that there's been economic growth, there's been per capita increases in wealth, but when you see that 130 Tibetans have self-immolated in the last 3 years, or that the number of Uyghurs going to prison now is on the order of probably 1,000 a year for splitism, which is a unique crime. Very hard to argue it's getting better there. So when you look at the whole picture, in some areas are getting better, in some areas are getting worse. And part of recognizing where it's getting better is to understand the Chinese government's strategy for dealing with human rights. And what is that strategy? I think it's very straightforward. To improve the human rights for the majority of Chinese citizens. And at the same time, I think there is recognition, though no political will, I think, to do something about it. There's a recognition that in certain respects, for minorities and for that very small percentage of the population that's engaged in what they call subversion, it is not getting better. And I think we missed that. I remember the first time I testified in Congress for China's trade status in 1990. Many of the student leaders who came to testify, and NGOs and others, said, hey, this regime is on its last legs. It's going down. It will collapse within months. Well, guess what? In fact, there was even a book written on this, The Coming Collapse of China. And this guy predicted that China would have collapsed, I think, 2 years ago already. And then he had to write an op-ed in which he said, okay, I was a bit off, but it will collapse at the end of 2012. I don't know what he's going to do about this. But, you know, I think we should all learn a lesson from this. But no, seriously. So what I'm saying is, unless we understand that as far as the Chinese government is concerned, they're going to work on improving the rights of the majority of Chinese, the great majority. And in the process, they will not improve the rights of others. Now, a perfect example, death penalty, number of executions. This is an area I've done a lot of work. All right, in 2012, we estimate that there were at least 12,000 executions in China. All right? Last year, we think it was around 3,000. That's a 75% decrease in the number of executions. Now, nothing is more disruptive to a harmonious society than wrongly executing someone. All right? So, in this area, Chinese citizens are confident, maybe not the right word, but understand, to some extent appreciate, that there is a significantly smaller chance of being executed for crimes like illegal lending, economic crimes. Right? So they are, in fact, trying to reduce the number of executions. One of the ways is by reducing the number of crimes that carry the death penalty. I think they're down to 55. So that's a long answer to your excellent question before. Whether or not the Chinese government uses me, well, in life, we're often used. You got to, you know, what are you used for? If the Chinese government wants to point to their work with me as an example of how to handle discussions of human rights, okay. What we should be doing is getting more people to engage with them like this, all right? But I'm sorry to say, my deepest regret, after all these years, I came out of the business community. I can't think of a single other example of a business person who has bothered to try to improve rights of free prisoners. Not one. So to me, it's not so much, well, you know, they're favoring you, they're working with you, they don't work with others. Yeah, they don't work with others. Why? Because others don't want to work on this. Read today's New York Times. What did Bloomberg do? Do you see what Bloomberg did yesterday in Hong Kong? What did they do? They said, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't have published those articles based on investigative reporting on the wealth of the Xi Jinping family. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea. All right? Huh? So far from taking up the cause of human rights in China or anywhere else, corporations basically go the other way. And they applaud the governments for what they're doing, and they don't object, and they even facilitate. I've seen a lot of that. So, you know, that's how I feel about it. Not strong, of course. Yes, please. We still have a little time, I hope. Yes.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about your relationship with other human rights organizations that are working on the same topics you are, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch.
No, they're very good. I just, you know, I just got an email from a Tibetan group, and they wanted to do a little work together on a particular case, and you know, they want to talk and see what else we can do. I would imagine that we are in touch with virtually every human rights group at some time, and we have very good working relationships. They take a different approach. But as I think I've said on other occasions, if I didn't exist, I'd have to be invented. You have to have something over here that is different from what's over there. How do I explain that better? You got to have a good cop for every bad cop. In this case, you got a good cop and 24 bad cops at the moment. That's how the Chinese government looks at it. So, as Robin Monroe, an old friend, once put it, you know, our job, Human Rights Watch, is to beat up China so hard, to shame them and name them and shame them, beat them up so hard that it hurts. Kamm's job is to go in and say, hey, here's how to make it feel better. It's basically what's been going on for years. So the relationships are all very good, honestly, all very good. Look, you can do your internet research, but if you can find even one example of a fellow human rights activist who works on China, who has ever criticized me, or at least in the last 20 years. I must admit, in the very beginning, there was a lot of skepticism. But right now, I honestly do not remember a single criticism of my work by a human rights activist or group in the last 20 years. So, I think that speaks for it. Yes?
You just mentioned businesses facilitating various things. How are foreign businesses perhaps facilitating abuses?
Well, I just gave an example.
Okay.
Bloomberg.
Okay.
Right. Basically, Bloomberg is saying, well, yeah, maybe we should practice censorship.
Right.
I mean, which is for a news organization. And why? Well, we can't ignore this market. It's just too big. We can't ignore it.
If I can ask a follow-up.
I mean, I could give you other examples, but
do you
go ahead.
are, with respect to the one-child policy and the way that's enforced,
Right.
Are foreign businesses or joint ventures complying with the one-child policy among their employees?
That's very hard to say. So much goes on that, frankly, they don't know about. All right? In every joint venture, you've got a party branch. And policies are carried out without necessarily the knowledge. There is a reform to the one-child policy. If either of a couple are only children, you can have another kid. So that's a pretty significant reform. But it's interesting. What's that old saying? No good deed goes unpunished. When I was in Beijing and this was announced, I was in the cab, I was yakking away with the driver. He says, look, I'm 40 years old. Huh? We're not going to have another kid now. How come this wasn't changed 10 years ago? Very good question, So he feels sort of resentful. Good for them, but what about us? What about all of us? So that's the new policy. I have actually once heard of a factory manager who did confront a situation in which a woman was being subjected. And, well, good for him. I'm not sure it did any good. I think the employee was removed from the factory and, he didn't know what happened. But there have been a few examples, but very, very few. Very few. I mean, we've had senior executives go to China in the wake of Tiananmen and praise the Chinese government. So you did the right thing. We don't have to do that. By the way, the Chinese government isn't fooled by this stuff. They actually, and the other thing that I tell you, Chinese officials really sort of are fed up with is foreigners coming to China and telling them what a great job they've done raising people out of poverty. This is always sort of the setup. You've done such a wonderful job raising people out of poverty. But the rest of your human rights record stinks. They really are kind of tired of it. Hey, get to the point. Lay it out. But don't butter them up by saying, oh, what a great job you're doing with this and that. It doesn't work. They know why you're there. And if you, by the way, if you're a government official, you can't act like John Kamm. Remember, I'm not a government official. I'm a salesman. All right? I could never work for a government. I couldn't. It's just beyond the capacity of my limited thinking to work for a government. I got to do what I believe in doing, not what some government or some guy upstairs tells me to do. I can't do it. So I've never worked for the government. Actually, I don't think I've ever worked for anyone, even when I was. All right, any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned non-custodial measures as one of the areas of interest.
Yes.
And do you think, just given that even globally there's a resistance towards that, is it overly ambitious to expect a conservative government to adopt those measures?
Well, I think in the case of China, because custodial punishment is so high in terms of the percentage, to bring it down a few percentage points, I'm talking about juveniles now, but with women as well. To me, it's much too early to say that this is successful. But we do see in other countries better implementation of non-custodial measures. For instance, India. We had one of India's really top experts in this field, Kamm, and she made some very good points, but at any given time in India, 16,000 women are in prison. Imagine that, for a country the size of India. In China, it's 100,000. In India, it's 16,000. But she didn't make a very good point. That's at any given point in time. During the year, women are coming in and they're going out. So it's a fluid situation. She was really arguing against, okay, we got to stop this. At this point in time, this is how many women are in prison. In fact, what you should be asking is, in the course of a year, how many women go through the system? That's a different question, because they are all subjected to these kind of policies and practices. Not just the people who are there who last the whole year. You can be in there. In Hong Kong, most women are there for only about 6 months. Right? During the year, you should be looking at, so if they're 20%, you look at the whole population, basically you double the number of women who have been in prison during that year. Non-custodial measures, especially when you have conservative governments, like we have in some states, it's very challenging. Certainly in California, I don't see it. When they, I'll tell you a story. Of course, one way of enforcing a non-custodial punishment is to wear an ankle bracelet, right? Tracking device. I don't like it, but I guess it's better than being behind bars. So the lady from India, though, she really didn't like this. We had a Chinese presenter, the Chinese government, and this guy gets up and he unveils a patented watch that is a tracking device. He says, women wear skirts, they've got ankle bracelets, very, very humiliating. Here's a very nice watch, very stylish watch that she can wear. And so the Indian woman said, well, still, I really object to this kind of, it's degrading, to do this. And he says, funny you should mention that. He says, I've got a patent for this watch. I've got a big market in India. But there you go. Very stylish. Watch looks great. But in California, they don't even let you out with the ankle bracelet. You served your time. If it's a federal prison, you get 1 day off for 7 days. That's sentence. That's it. We basically gutted the parole and induction system in this country. For federal crimes, doesn't exist anymore. So the only way out of that now, in the state of California, is the federal government has stepped in, and the courts have mandated that the prisons reduce the number of prisoners. It's outrageous. I was in San Quentin. You've got to see this to believe it. You've got prisoners, bunk by bunk, triple bunks, occupying the entire gymnasium. Just unbelievable. So the federal government and the courts have said, you have got to, but even a liberal, progressive governor like Jerry Brown says, we can't do it. We're not going to do it. Can't do it. We're not going to put these people back in. Yes?
Yes. Yeah, you just mentioned that in Tibet and Mongolia there is economic growth and life is getting better.
Well,
so actually I am from Mongolia, and just I want to know which Mongolia are you talking about, because there are still the two Mongolia, which is the outer Mongolia and the inner Mongolia.
Right.
Outer Mongolia is an independent country, which I'm from, and Inner Mongolia is still part of China.
Right.
But unfortunately, in the world, some people think that whole Mongolia is a part of China. So I just want to get some clarification. Which Mongolia are you talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm only referring to that part of Mongolia that is in China.
Okay.
Actually, you know, I went to Mongolia in 1990, right after the revolution.
Oh, okay. So you know very well.
Well, I can't say I know very well, but I went there and I was very interested by what I saw and what I heard. I was told, I don't know if this is true or not, but I was told by a friend in Mongolia that after Stalin died and the Soviet Union sent, who would it have been? Not Malenkov, but somebody like that. Yeah. Kosygin. Maybe.
Yeah.
So he sends the Soviet Union sends people out to deliver the following message. Okay. Stalin did many good things, but he also made some mistakes, and we have to correct them. So Kosygin goes to see Chairman Mao, and he says, Stalin made some mistakes, they have to be corrected. And Mao apparently said, well, we hope the first one he corrects is Mongolia. Because, and this is what people don't remember this. China is talking about territorial integrity. China will never give up an inch of its territory. It's sacred, the territory, Taiwan, South China Sea, Tibet. Well, guess what? Historically, China gave up Mongolia, Outer Mongolia. Gave it up because of Joseph Stalin. They did what Stalin wanted them to do. Still, when you go to Taiwan, I guess you know this, the map of China on the wall includes Mongolia. The whole map has got Mongolia.
Yeah, that's true.
It's in Taiwan.
Yeah, that's
So, very interesting. You have your hand up. I'm happy to go on, but yes.
Let's make this the last question.
Chris says last question. Okay, we got one here.
I'm a business scholar, come from China,
Mhm.
and I'm also assistant professor in a university in China. And I have a question. As I know, people come from Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. They enjoy more villagers. They enjoy more rights than people come from other parts of China. For example, children come from Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia.
Yep.
They only need 200 scores to enter to top universities such as Peking University and Tsinghua universities. But for other parts in China, they need 700 scores to enter those universities. And another example is people come from Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. They cannot obey the policy of one child only. They can have more than 1, 2, 3 if they like. And also for universities, we sometimes when we want to apply for the funds supported by the government. If the university is in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Mongolia, they can always have much more financial support from government and also some other subsidies. A lot of money. Sometimes as teachers we are jealous about that. And also if the faculty publish their papers, apply for the project. But I think some they can enjoy super national treatment than other parts in China. So do you think it's a kind of super national treatment or it's a kind of discrimination?
Well, maybe
I
both, actually. Because in some...
Yes, because I'm so strange that why they have so much criticism for Chinese government, but actually they really enjoy much more rights than other parts of China. So why?
Well, that's a good question. The way I would answer your question is asking you a question. Okay? Why have 130 Tibetans self-immolated in the last 3 years. They have burned themselves up. Why?
Why?
Yeah. Well, something must be wrong, right? Because, you know, in Tibetan Buddhism, there is no tradition for suicide or self-immolation. None. It has just started 3 years ago. And 130 monks and nuns have committed suicide this way. For me, I'd like to find out why. If, in fact, they're being treated better than anyone else, why are they doing
Yeah,
it?
much better.
But why? If they're being treated better, why would they commit suicide? You ask good questions, I try to answer your question with a question. I don't know either, but something's got to be wrong. All right? I think in some respects, especially outside of Tibet, if Tibetans go outside to another province, yes. But maybe in terms of Tibet itself, yeah, they can have more children. But at the same time, you know, I've been to Tibet a couple of times. And to me, Tibet is a very, very different place, a very different country. I used to work on Native American reservations in the Southwest, and it's a very similar feeling. I mean, they're very, very different people. And one thing is, I have never, ever encountered a people who are so religious. You know, I'm sure you know this, in their lifetimes, they make a pilgrimage to the Potala. You know how they get there, right? They prostrate themselves the whole way. Down, get up, down. I mean, some of these are 500, 600 kilometers they'll do this. I have been in the Potala. When one of these people come in, you can imagine the shape they're in. They take out of their garments whatever money they have. Little, greasy, ripped up banknotes, everything they have, and they'll throw it at the Buddha. They'll throw everything they have. I've never seen anything like this. They're an intensely spiritual people. So maybe it is that for the Tibetans, spiritual life is more important than material life. Maybe it is because they deeply revere the Dalai Lama. And if all they hear from the Chinese government is what a terrible person this Dalai Lama is, and you shouldn't have anything to do with him, and you better not hang his portrait in your house, maybe that's what affects them. So in life, sometimes the spiritual, who am I telling this at Notre Dame? Sometimes the spiritual is more important than the material. But you make a good point. I think materially, yes. And I said that. Conditions, economic conditions, people are better off. But spiritually, I'm not convinced they are.
Well, thank you, John.
Oh.
Let's everybody join me. I'm sure you can stick around for 5 or so minutes, so any questions that haven't been answered